It was 1961. I was at a conference in Geneva, one of those enormous physics affairs where half the Nobel laureates in the world are crammed into the same hotel, and everyone is very politely pretending they're not competing with each other. I was standing in a hallway, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, talking to a man I'd just met. He was a Jesuit priest, also a physicist, quite a good one actually, and we were getting along fine, talking about renormalization, talking about path integrals, when he stopped, looked me very carefully in the eye, and said, "Dr. Feynman, do you believe in God?" Now, I've been asked that question hundreds of times. By students, by journalists, by my mother. But something about the way this man asked it quietly, without any edge to it, like he genuinely wanted to know, made me stop and think about whether I'd ever actually answered it honestly. Not cleverly. Honestly. I put down the cold coffee, and I told him something I'd never quite said out loud before. I want to tell you what I said. And more importantly, I want to tell you why I am, because the why took me 60 years of physics to arrive at, and it is considerably stranger than either of us expected. Here is the claim I'm going to demonstrate today, not spiritually, not poetically, not as a metaphor for human longing, but physically, logically, with the same standards I'd apply to any hypothesis in quantum electrodynamics. The God that most people believe in, the one who listens to prayers, who designed the universe, who knows everything that will happen and judges everything that has happened, that God, examined with the tools of physics and logic, turns out to be not merely unproven. It turns out to be mathematically self-contradictory, a concept that collapses under the weight of its own definitions. And here is the part that surprised even me. That conclusion does not leave you with nothing. It leaves you with something far stranger. Something I find genuinely harder to dismiss than anything religion ever offered me. But we have to follow the logic first, without flinching. That's the deal. Before I go any further, I want to say something I mean completely. I am not doing this to win an argument. I genuinely don't care about winning arguments. I care about getting things right, which is a different activity entirely. Some of the people I loved most operated from deep religious faith, and I respected that without reservation. My father never pushed me toward or away from religion. He just pushed me toward honesty, which turns out to be the most demanding religion of all. And the priest in Geneva, the man who asked me the question, he was one of the most rigorous thinkers I met that year. His faith did not make him sloppy. If anything, it made him more precise, because he'd thought harder about these questions than most people are willing to. So what I'm about to do is not a demolition. I have no interest in demolition. What I'm going to do is follow the logic, because that is the only thing I know how to do well. And I want to be honest with you. I tried to find the errors in my own reasoning. I looked from every angle I could find. I am going to show you exactly what I found. There are 4 problems, not arguments against religion in the cultural or social sense. I'll leave that to people who enjoy that kind of argument. 4 specific, structural, logical problems with the God concept itself, with what God is supposed to be. Each one is a puzzle. I genuinely tried to think my way around before accepting that I couldn't. The first is the definition problem, what God actually is, stated precisely enough to evaluate. The second is the interaction problem, how a non-physical mind alters physical reality without a specified mechanism. The third is the complexity trap, the one I find most elegant, in the way a really clean proof is elegant. And the fourth is the knowledge problem, the one I find most devastating, because it doesn't leave the concept bruised. It leaves it incoherent. 4 problems. Let's go through them one at a time, with no sleight of hand. Here is a rule I apply to every claim in physics before I evaluate it. You cannot test a claim you cannot state. Sounds obvious. Try applying it to God. Ask 10 deeply religious people to define God precisely, not describe their experience of God, not tell you what God means to them emotionally, but define God. Give you a description precise enough that you could in principle distinguish a universe with God from a universe without God. You will get 10 different answers. Several of them will explicitly resist the test. God is beyond definition. God transcends human categories. To define God is to limit God. And here is what bothers me about that last answer. It sounds humble. It sounds appropriately respectful of mystery. But logically, it is the most problematic answer of all. Because here's the thing. If God has no properties that distinguish God's presence from God's absence, if any possible universe, full of unanswered prayers and preventable suffering, is equally consistent with God existing and God not existing, then we are not comparing two hypotheses about reality. We are having an argument about the definition of a word. I have a name for entities defined entirely by their undetectability. I call them things that aren't there. And the God of sophisticated theology, the God who is pure being, ground of all existence, beyond all predication, has exactly this problem. Not mysterious, undefined. And undefined claims cannot be wrong, which means they also cannot be right. That was the first problem. And on its own, it would be enough to stop the conversation. But I want to keep going, because the next three are worse. Let's grant, for the sake of argument, that God exists and has some definable properties. The most important one, the one that makes God relevant rather than abstract, is this. God responds. God hears prayer. God intervenes. God adjusts the state of the physical world based on information received from human beings. That is a physical claim. And physics has a question for it. What is the mechanism? When I want to understand how something in the physical world interacts with something else, I ask, what carries the interaction? Electromagnetism is carried by photons. Gravity, in Einstein's formulation, works through the curvature of spacetime. The weak nuclear force operates through W and Z bosons. Every interaction we have ever measured has a mechanism, a specific, describable, testable way that cause connects to effect. What is the mechanism by which a thought, a pattern of electrochemical activity inside a human skull, is received by a non-physical entity with no spatial location, processed by a mind with no neurons, and converted into a physical change in the state of matter and energy somewhere in the observable universe? I spent a lot of time with this question. Every mechanism I could construct either gives God physical properties, mass, energy, spatial extent, in which case God becomes part of the natural world and subject to natural investigation, or it requires an interaction that violates what we understand about how physical systems work. Neither option is comfortable. The first turns God into something science can eventually find or not find. The second requires us to accept that our most precisely tested understanding of reality is wrong in a domain that conveniently cannot be examined. That is not a position I can defend with a straight face. And what comes next, I want to warn you, is the argument that made me stop trying to find the exit. Subscribe, because we're about to go somewhere considerably heavier. Back in 30 seconds. This is the one I find most elegant. And by elegant I mean the kind of clean that a really good proof has, where the result seems almost too neat, and then you check it again and it's correct. The most common argument for God's existence, in every culture, in every century, is the argument from complexity. Look at the universe. Look at living things. Look at the extraordinary, improbable, intricately organized structure of it all. Something this complex must have been designed. Design requires a designer. Therefore God. Now I understand why this is compelling. When you look at a single enzyme, the way it folds into exactly the right three-dimensional shape to catalyze exactly the right reaction, it does look, for a moment, like something intended. But here is the problem with the argument from complexity, and it is a problem I find genuinely devastating. God as described is more complex than anything God supposedly created. Follow this carefully, because the logic matters. The claim is that complex things require a designer. The universe is complex. Therefore it requires a designer. God. But what is God? Omniscient, knowing everything, containing complete information about every quantum state of every particle across all of time. Omnipotent, capable of any action, holding every possible causal power. Omnipresent, aware across all of space simultaneously. The information content of an omniscient God is vastly greater than the information content of the universe that God supposedly created. So by the logic of the argument itself, God requires a designer of even greater complexity. Who requires a designer? Infinitely. The argument from complexity, if it proves anything, proves that the designer needs explaining more urgently than the design. You haven't solved the problem. You've made it exponentially bigger. The only escape is to exempt God from the argument, to say complexity doesn't require explanation when the complex thing is God. But the moment you say that, you've accepted that some complex things don't require a designer. And if that's true, the universe doesn't need one either. There's no third option. I've looked. There isn't one. This is the one that keeps me up. Not because it's frightening. I've made peace with uncomfortable conclusions, but because it's where the concept doesn't end up bruised. It ends up incoherent. God is omniscient. God knows everything. Past, present, future. Every thought, every event, every quantum state throughout all of time. To know the future genuinely, completely, you need one of two things. Either the future is fully determined, every event is the inevitable result of prior causes, with no genuine randomness anywhere. A clockwork universe. Laplace's demon made divine. Or the future contains genuine randomness, events not determined by prior causes, and God somehow knows the outcome of those events in advance. Take the first option. Determinism. If every future event, including every human decision, is already determined by prior causes, then free will is an illusion. What feels like choosing is the predetermined unfolding of a causal chain fixed at the beginning of the universe. And a God who created a deterministic universe and then judges its inhabitants for their predetermined behavior is running a trial where the verdict was written before the accused was born. That is not justice. That is theater. Take the second option. God knows the outcome of genuinely random quantum events before they occur. But quantum mechanics, the most precisely tested theory in the history of science, accurate to 1 part in 10 billion, tells us that these outcomes are not merely unknown. They are unknowable in principle. The uncertainty is a feature of reality, not of our ignorance. If God knows the outcome of a genuinely random event in advance, then either the event isn't genuinely random, back to determinism, with all its problems, or God's knowledge doesn't constrain the event, which means it isn't knowledge in any sense I can define. I've spent my life comfortable with paradox. Particles in two places at once. Time running differently depending on speed. I can live with strange. But this is not a paradox. A paradox has a resolution. This has a dissolution. The concept of divine omniscience, examined carefully, does not reveal itself to be deeply mysterious. It reveals itself to be logically incoherent. That is a different thing. A very important different thing. So here is where I stood in that hallway in Geneva, holding cold coffee, looking at a man whose intellectual honesty I genuinely respected. I told him, I can't find the God you're describing inside the universe I study. Not because I haven't looked. Because every tool I have for looking gives me the same answer. The concept, examined at the precision it requires, doesn't hold together. The definition problem means God might not be a hypothesis at all. The interaction problem means the mechanism is unspecified. The complexity trap means the argument that points to God points past God forever. The knowledge problem means omniscience, worked through carefully, is not deep, it's broken. He listened. He didn't argue. He said, then what do you find when you look? And this is the part I didn't expect to say. When I look as carefully as I can, with everything I know, I find something that genuinely astonishes me every time I encounter it. Not warm astonishment. Cold, clean, almost vertiginous astonishment. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. It contains somewhere between 2 trillion and 20 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy holds hundreds of billions of stars. And somehow, on one unremarkable planet around one average star, a process of molecular chemistry got going that over 4 billion years produced something capable of looking back at all of that and asking what it is. The religious statement says someone arranged this, which oddly makes it less astonishing. Arranged things are less surprising than things that arrange themselves. The physical statement says, given the laws of this universe, given the initial conditions, this is what happens. Chemistry becomes biology. Biology becomes complexity. Complexity becomes complexity. And eventually, not inevitably, but actually, because it actually happened, the universe produces something that can ask about itself. I don't have a name for whatever is remarkable about that. The priest told me religion has a name for it. I told him, I know. I'm just not sure the name fits the thing. I want to tell you how that conversation ended, because I've thought about it for 60 years and I think the ending is the most honest part. The priest and I stood there for a while longer, both of us quiet. He said, "You know, Feynman, I think you believe in something. You just refuse to call it anything." I told him that was probably the most accurate description of my position I had ever heard. My father taught me on those walks in the woods outside Far Rockaway, pointing at birds I didn't know the names of, that knowing what something is called and knowing what something is are two entirely different activities. He was right. The name we give to the mystery has never changed what the mystery is. The God I can't find in the physics is the God with specified properties, defined mechanisms, internal logical consistency. That God dissolves under examination. But the fact that mathematics works, that abstract structures developed by following logic in the dark turn out to describe, to 10 decimal places, the actual behavior of electrons. That fact I have no explanation for. The fact that the universe is the kind of thing that produces minds capable of asking what it is. That fact I have no explanation for. The priest shook my hand when we parted. He said he appreciated my honesty. I told him I appreciated his question. Because here is what I have learned. The questions that don't resolve are not the failures of inquiry. They are the proof that the inquiry is working. Every closed answer, God did it. It's just the way things are. Every answer that tries to shut the question down, those are the ones that stop the investigation. The open ones, the ones that sit with uncertainty and say I genuinely don't know, and that is fascinating, those are the ones that change everything. My father was right about the bird. Knowing the name is not knowing the thing. And whatever this is, this universe that produces minds capable of asking what it is, no one has found its real name yet. If that doesn't give you something to think about, subscribe, because next time we follow the evidence somewhere even stranger. I'll see you there.